November 23, 1944. Above the fog-draped ridgelines of the Ardennes forest, near the border of Belgium and Germany, the C-47's engines droned in steady unison, slicing through the late autumn sky as if unaware of the tension lingering in the forest below. Inside the cargo bay, Staff Sergeant Thomas "Tommy" Daniels adjusted his leather flight cap and stared down at the bundles stacked beneath the netting. They weren't crates of ammunition. They weren't medical kits or fuel bladders. They were turkeys, cooked, wrapped, and tightly sealed in canvas bundles, strapped with parachutes. Daniels leaned toward the open door. Cold wind whipped at his cheeks. Beneath the aircraft, the snow-dusted treetops of the Ardennes blurred past, where elements of the 28th Infantry Division held exposed positions along the Siegfried Line's outer edge. The line had gone quiet in recent days, too quiet. German patrols were thinning. Radio chatter suggested enemy troops had pulled back slightly, giving the illusion of calm. But the Americans knew better. Morale had dipped. Frostbite was rising. Rations were reduced. Thanksgiving was tomorrow, but for most of the infantry, it might as well have been months away. The 9th Troop Carrier Command had received the order less than 72 hours prior. A surprise resupply mission, not of arms or ammunition, but of morale. General Leonard T. Gero himself had signed off on the plan. Turkeys, stuffing, cranberry tins, and pies, airlifted straight into the combat zone. It was, by every measure, absurd. And yet, for those in the muddy foxholes and half-frozen trenches, it might be the only warmth they'd feel that week. In a clearing near the village of Wiltz, Private First Class Ray Kowalski of the 112th Infantry crouched beside a smoldering fire pit, warming his gloved hands. His M1 Garand lay across his lap. Around him, his squad huddled silently, the sound of distant artillery muffled by snow-covered woods. It had been 3 days since their last hot meal. Most of their Thanksgiving plans involved powdered eggs and a half-loaf of bread salvaged from a Belgian kitchen. When Kowalski heard the drone of approaching engines, he assumed it was another run of fuel or wire spools. Then came the drop. Canvas-wrapped bundles began to flutter down in parachutes, some landing in trees, others crashing softly into snowbanks or open clearings. A few men ran toward the nearest one with bayonets drawn, expecting perhaps emergency ammo. What they found instead stunned them: full roasted turkeys, warm to the touch, their scent barely contained by canvas and waxed paper. Cans of cranberry sauce, wrapped in cloth to prevent denting. Pumpkin pies with hand-tied ribbons. One bundle even included a letter signed by General Gero. "This Thanksgiving, we send you not only food, but our gratitude." Across a narrow valley, Oberleutnant Dieter Hess peered through his Zeiss field glasses from a camouflaged observation post nestled beneath frost-heavy pines. He saw the plane's first, low-flying, unarmed transports with U.S. markings. Hess tapped the shoulder of the Feldwebel beside him and pointed to the small white parachutes unfurling in clusters. "Supplies?" the sergeant muttered. Hess squinted. "I don't think so. That one just landed in the snow. It looks like poultry?" They watched in confusion as American infantrymen gathered around the bundles, whooping and laughing. One of the GIs hoisted a bird above his head like a prize. From the German perspective, it was bizarre. Borderline surreal. The enemy, cold, wet, surrounded by the threat of renewed attack, was throwing a holiday feast? Back in the American lines, Staff Sergeant Daniels' crew circled for another drop. From the co-pilot seat, Lieutenant Miles Scanlon grinned. "Think they'll believe it back home?" Daniels shook his head. "Doesn't matter. They'll eat." One jeep from a regimental command post pulled up near a clearing where a dozen turkeys lay intact. A young radio operator dismounted, stared at the packages, and muttered, "You gotta be kidding me." On the far edge of the same clearing, a thin column of steam rose from a makeshift cookfire as the first slice of turkey hit a mess tin. Kowalski sat cross-legged beside it, watching as Sergeant Ellis carved another bird with his bayonet. "Better eat fast," Ellis said. "We're still in Kraut country." But even he couldn't hide the ghost of a smile. The smell carried first. It drifted through the trees in thin, impossible threads: warm fat, roasted skin, something faintly sweet. To the American soldiers clustered around their foxholes, it smelled like home. To the German troops watching from across the frozen gullies and tree lines, it smelled like a mistake in the world. Oberleutnant Dieter Hess lowered his binoculars slowly. He had served in France in 1940, in Russia in 1942, and now here, in the Ardennes, where the forest pressed in tight and visibility collapsed to a few dozen meters. He had seen enemy supply drops before, ammo, fuel, medical crates smashed open by impact. But never this. He watched as American soldiers formed loose lines around the parachuted bundles. There was no panic. No urgency. Rifles leaned against trees. Helmets came off. One man wiped his hands on his trousers before reaching into a canvas-wrapped package like he was opening a gift. Hess turned to his platoon sergeant, Feldwebel Kruger. "Are they insane?" he asked quietly. Kruger frowned, adjusting the scarf around his neck. "Or confident?" That word lingered. Across the valley, Private First Class Ray Kowalski balanced a mess tin on his knee as Sergeant Ellis finished carving. The turkey wasn't pretty, edges torn, juices running, but it was real. Steam rose into the cold air. Men passed tins hand to hand. Someone produced a spoon that hadn't been bent flat by weeks of use. Another man swore softly when cranberry sauce spilled into the snow. They ate fast but not in silence. Stories came out, about Brooklyn, about Iowa farms, about Thanksgiving tables that felt a lifetime away. For a few minutes, the forest stopped feeling like enemy territory and started feeling like a place where men were simply waiting to go home. And that was what unsettled the Germans most. From their position, Hess could hear laughter. Not loud, not careless, but unmistakable. It cut through the cold in a way artillery never did. This wasn't desperation. This wasn't bravado. It was something harder to counter. "Who drops food in a combat zone?" one German private muttered. Hess didn't answer. He was thinking about logistics. About the distance from American depots to these forests. About the aircraft overhead, unarmed, slow, vulnerable, and what it meant that the Americans were willing to risk them for a meal. Back at regimental headquarters, an American liaison officer read out the confirmation report over the radio. Drops successful. Minimal losses. Morale impact significant. No one wrote that part down officially. As dusk crept in, American positions tightened again. Rifles were cleaned. Perimeters rechecked. The war didn't stop. But something had shifted. Men who had been counting days now counted moments. The meal had done its job. On the German side, Hess filed his evening report with clipped precision. Enemy activity normal. No movement detected. Morale, he paused, appears unusually high. He underlined the last word twice. That night, as temperatures dropped further and frost coated the branches, the Americans finished what they could and buried the remains to avoid attracting animals. The forest reclaimed its silence. But the memory lingered, on both sides of the line. The Germans had expected shells, not celebration. And that expectation, once broken, could not be repaired easily. November 24, 1944. Thanksgiving Day. Ardennes front, pre-dawn. The forest woke slowly, as if reluctant to return to war. Frost glazed the leaves and branches in a thin white skin. Boots crunched softly as American sentries changed shifts. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a single artillery round echoed, distant, probing, unanswered. The night had passed without incident. No German patrols tested the line. No harassing fire. For the first time in weeks, the front felt suspended. In a shallow foxhole reinforced with logs, Private First Class Ray Kowalski pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders. His stomach was full for the first time since arriving in Belgium. The turkey sat heavy and warm inside him, not as food, but as memory. He hadn't slept well, but not because of cold. Because every time he closed his eyes, he saw his mother's kitchen table in Pittsburgh, steam rising from a platter just like the one they'd passed around yesterday. Around him, the men were quieter than usual. Not withdrawn. Reflective. Sergeant Ellis knelt near a small fire, heating coffee. He glanced at his watch and shook his head. "You know," he muttered, "back home they're probably arguing over who gets the last drumstick." Kowalski smiled faintly. Further up the line, Captain Harold Vance reviewed his morning report. Ammunition steady. Casualties low. Communications intact. But what caught his eye wasn't written. It was what he saw outside his command dugout. Men moving with a different posture. Shoulders back. Faces alert. Not eager, but ready. He'd commanded men in North Africa and Italy. He knew the signs. The turkey drop hadn't fed bodies. It had reset minds. Across the valley, Oberleutnant Dieter Hess stood with his coat collar turned up, scanning the American lines through fog-thick air. No movement. No nervous shifting. No signs of exhaustion. If anything, the Americans looked settled. That troubled him more than artillery ever had. He thought back to his own last Thanksgiving, 1941, before the Eastern Front. There had been no turkey then. Just thin soup and a speech. Since then, holidays had dissolved into dates on a calendar, stripped of meaning by hunger and retreat. He turned to Kruger. They flew aircraft, he said slowly, over contested territory, to deliver cooked food. Kruger nodded. Which means they have enough aircraft to spare. And enough fuel. And enough confidence, Hess added. The realization settled like ice in his chest. At mid-morning, American supply planes passed overhead again, but this time without drops. The sound alone was enough. Men looked up, smirked, and went back to their work. The message had already been delivered. In a rear area briefing tent miles away, Colonel James Whitaker of the 9th Troop Carrier Command listened as the mission was reviewed. Losses? None. Enemy response? Minimal. Effect? Immeasurable. One officer asked the question everyone was thinking. Was it worth the risk? Whitaker didn't hesitate. If you can remind a soldier why he's fighting, he said, you can ask him to hold any line. That afternoon, German artillery fired a short barrage. Testing, cautious. The Americans answered with discipline and restraint. No overreaction. No panic. The line held. Hess watched the exchange through his glasses and understood something he didn't want to admit. The turkeys weren't mockery. They were proof. Proof that the Americans weren't scraping by. Proof that they could afford to think beyond survival. Proof that even in a forest that would soon explode into one of the largest offensives of the war, they were already planning for tomorrow. That evening, Hess wrote another note in his journal. Not an official report. A private one. The enemy feeds morale as carefully as ammunition. This is a weapon we do not possess. Back in the foxholes, Kowalski cleaned his rifle by lantern light. He ran a cloth through the barrel slowly, methodically. When he finished, he tucked a small scrap of wax paper into his breast pocket, the last piece of wrapping from yesterday's meal. He didn't know why he kept it. He only knew he wasn't ready to let it go. The forest grew quiet again as darkness settled in. Somewhere far to the east, German units were already assembling. And somewhere above the clouds, American planners were already calculating what would be needed next, not just to fight, but to endure. November 25, 1944. Ardennes Forest. Sector D5. Snow had not yet come, but the cold hinted at it, an invisible pressure settling over the tree canopy, muting sound, tightening fingers, creeping into bone. The fog hung low, blue-gray and still, curling around the trunks of pine like smoke from a battle yet to begin. In an ammunition staging area 1 mile from the front, Corporal Thomas, Buddy, Forrester double-checked a manifest of shell crates. He worked with a kind of detached calm, hands raw and blackened, pencil tucked behind his ear. A day earlier, the crates would have felt heavier. But today, even after the Thanksgiving rush, he moved with a kind of unspoken ease. He paused to stretch, watching as a jeep passed along the frozen trail. 2 GIs in the back were laughing at something private, something normal. That was new. In the open field beside the trail, Chaplin's assistants had erected a crude wooden cross tied with canteen straps. It wasn't official. No orders had been given. It was simply built by men who had received more than food the day before. A reminder. Sergeant Myron Lewis passed it without stopping, but he tipped his helmet briefly as he did. He hadn't done that in months. Up front, Captain Vance reviewed a change in patrol rotations with his platoon sergeants. Even though the line remained quiet, he adjusted intervals. Not out of fear. Out of readiness. The Thanksgiving drop had shown something critical. Morale was like fuel. And now that it had been replenished, it needed to be protected. Don't overextend, he warned. Confidence isn't invincibility. The Germans, meanwhile, had been observing. Oberleutnant Hess noted the increased patrol regularity. He noted the tighter formation spacing. He noted the rebuilt listening posts, better camouflaged, better aligned. It was as if, overnight, the Americans had remembered who they were. He met with his company staff that evening beneath a tarpaulin strung between trees. The discussion was subdued, tinged with something he hadn't expected: anxiety. Not panic. Not fear. But the growing awareness that they were no longer facing a brittle force. "We've seen no signs of withdrawal," Kruger said. "No," Hess replied. "Only signs of preparation." Someone mentioned the word overconfidence. Hess shook his head. "This isn't arrogance," he said. "It's assurance." Back at SAF headquarters, news of the successful morale operation filtered upward. General Brereton of the 9th Air Force was briefed on the cultural impact, not just of the turkeys, but of what the drop symbolized. It became a case study in psychological warfare, not by deception or leaflets, but by proof of continuity. America didn't just feed its men. It reminded them they were still home, even in a foreign hell. General Eisenhower, when told of the operation's outcome, gave a rare nod without comment. But later that evening, according to his aide, he quietly requested that planners consider similar actions tied to dates the men might still carry in their bones. No one needed to ask what he meant. Christmas was 4 weeks away. Back in the forest, Private Kowalski sat with Ortega and Manzano beside a makeshift fire shielded with ammo tins. They passed around coffee, shared a few saltine crackers they'd hoarded. "Think they'll do it again?" Manzano asked. "For Christmas?" Ortega laughed. "What, drop a pine tree from AB-17? But Kowalski didn't laugh. He just stared into the flames and said, almost to himself, "They might." From far above, reconnaissance planes charted frozen fields and timbered ridges. Deep behind German lines, trucks moved at night. Tanks were repositioned. A counteroffensive was beginning to coil, weeks before it would strike. But along the American front, for one quiet stretch of hours, the line didn't sag. It didn't fray. It didn't break. Because somewhere in every foxhole was a man who now believed, not just that he might survive, but that someone remembered him. December 1, 1944. Northern Sector, Eifel Ridge. Oberleutnant Hess sat in a shallow communications dugout, listening to a crackling radio feed from his forward scouts. The mood was different now, not frantic, but distinctly unsettled. For days, his patrols had reported American positions unusually well fortified. Morale patrols were visible. Rotations were efficient. The usual signs of fatigue, sloppy guard shifts, disorganized transport, had faded. He leaned forward when a corporal relayed that U.S. engineers had begun reinforcing a previously abandoned logistics trail. "This far into winter?" Hess muttered. "Why now?" He had already filed a report on the peculiar aerial drop from a week prior. His phrasing had been cautious but revealing. The enemy sustains cultural rituals mid-conflict. This likely increases battlefield cohesion. At the time, his superiors dismissed it. But Hess hadn't. Back at the U.S. 28th Infantry Division's forward operating post, Thanksgiving was a memory, but the effects were still visible. The field kitchens remained unusually active. No more turkeys, of course, but stews, hot coffee, even reconstituted desserts were reaching trenches again. The sudden clarity of purpose that came with that absurd Thanksgiving moment had not faded. Corporal Forrester sat inside a supply tent, folding inventory sheets. They were down to standard rations again, but he still smiled when he spotted the faint grease stain on a manifest from November 23, shaped like a turkey leg. Some guys were calling it the sacred drop. Private Ortega kept one of the wax paper turkey wrappings folded in his shirt pocket. Not for food. For memory. For proof that it had happened. And at the battalion command post, a weathered notice remained tacked to the corkboard between orders and artillery fire plans. To every man who felt forgotten, We didn't forget. Happy Thanksgiving. U.S. Quartermaster Corps. But the most enduring impact of that day was felt silently by the enemy. Far behind the line, in a requisitioned hunting lodge outside Koblenz, Oberst Wilhelm Keitel reviewed Hess's report and raised an eyebrow. They dropped cooked food? He asked the adjutant. During a war? Yes, Herr Oberst. Delivered from high-altitude aircraft. No propaganda. Just food. He said nothing for a long moment, then returned to his notes. The Americans, he finally muttered, are a strange people. Later, in captured German diaries reviewed after the war, several entries from that late November period referenced Die Truthensoldaten, the Turkey soldiers. The phrase began as a joke. Then it shifted into something closer to a warning. Because by the time the Battle of the Bulge erupted 2 weeks later, many of the American units involved had already passed through that brief November fire. And when they held, when their lines bent but never collapsed, some credited the strength of winter logistics. But others, especially the ones who had been there, credited something else. Morale doesn't come from orders, wrote Sergeant Keller in a December 30th letter home. It comes from memory. That day, for a moment, we remembered what we were fighting for. And that was enough. The story of the Thanksgiving drop was never headline news. It didn't make the official war briefings or enter the films shown back home. But among the men who received it, frozen, sleepless, buried in mud, it became something close to sacred. Because in the midst of steel and fire and silence, a cooked bird falling from the sky had reminded them they were still human.